I'm really excited for three main reasons. One, if you enjoyed the previous presentation, I think this is going to complement a lot of the discussion that came out of that. So hold on to your seats. Number two, I'm really excited just to talk, and I get a little nervous. So, hopefully you'll give me a bit of a break on that. And number three, this is my last official act before I go on vacation for over a week. So, once we're done here, boom, I'm off to the beach. So 1, 2, 3. We're here to talk about how we can use data science, or as Ryan rightly pointed out, statistics. Don't believe the hype about data science. It's just a propaganda rebrand to try and make statistics a little more palatable for the new kids. But we're going to talk specifically about how we can use it to better defend and better negotiate if and when the time comes for negotiating ransoms. Who am I? I'm John Sturgis. I'm currently a data scientist at the Cyentia Institute. I started in cyber in 2012. I've worked as a security analyst, a little bit of incident response, a little bit of security operations, some vulnerability management, and my last role before jumping into data science was more of a GRC role as a risk manager. I'm also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm a recovering World of Warcraft addict. When I'm not playing with my kids, I'm probably watching a streamer play hardcore vanilla WoW, which is hilarious to watch if you happen to be in the know, and if you're looking for something to watch this weekend. So who is Cyentia? Well, we are a research institute that specializes in cybersecurity. So it's just a couple of us. We're data and security nerds, and our passion is bringing data to bear on big questions in cybersecurity. What that means in practice is really partnering with a variety of large vendors to get access to their data sets. We get to publish open research for anyone who wants to read it. They get to do some marketing around it. It's kind of win-win. What that means for us is we get kind of both a wide and a deep view into data across the industry, whether it's application security, vulnerability management, first or third party risk, incident response, yada, yada, yada. If you like what the DBIR does, or liked what it did in its heyday several years ago, you'd probably like some of what we produce. So pertinent to this crowd today, we're looking at some research we started in 2022 that we labeled the Investigative Cybercrime Series. We partnered with a vendor named Arete, who conducts a variety of incident response as well as ransom negotiation work for their clients. And we were curious about what big questions we could investigate and answer with access to their data set. We published the two big volumes, or volumes 1 and 2, and we're also publishing some other sector specific kind of smaller publications this year, the first of which was healthcare here recently. When I was writing these, I kind of thought of volume 1 as like defender and volume 2 as offense. So if you want to think of it as defense and offense, that's a good lens to look at them. Now, what's in the data? Well, Arete, I mentioned they provide incident response, various risk and management services, and advisory services. The data set in question, we're looking at about 1,500 ransomware events, whether they handled the response or just the negotiations component, covering about 3 years, several industries, an eye-popping amount in demands, a smaller but still somewhat eye-popping amount in payments, and covering the activities for over 100 ransomware families. So let's get into the big questions. The first we had was, what influences demand amounts? Now, you're going to feel the trend here that there are several things that we find that influence them, that you expect, some that you don't expect, some that defenders can control, and others that defenders can't control. So it's helpful to just, you're not crazy, that is the case. Starting off with kind of the first thing that happens, though, the demand that comes in. What influences that? Well, you're probably aware that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence around, such and such industry gets targeted with, quote, much larger demands because whatever reason, right? We wanted to put that question to the test, and what we found is that the answer is slightly more complicated. I'm going to walk through this chart because it has some elements that will be repeated down the road, so I hope you'll bear with me. The first thing I'll note is that the x-axis is not linear, it's more of a log scale, and we'll see that in other charts. And what that just means is as you move to the right, rather than adding, you are multiplying in many cases. So the same unit of length is multiplied rather than added. There is a bit of a distortion here around the 150 to 250K, because that's where a lot of the typical amounts land. Speaking of typical, we are not using averages here. We'll touch on this later, but averages are problematic in the realm of demands and payments because the distribution of those values is what's known as log normal. And all that really means is, imagine you had 9 ransoms for $1 each and a 10th for $1,000. If you took the average of that distribution, it wouldn't be $1. It would be stretched toward that outlier value closer to $100. And I don't think there's anyone in this group that would think that that is what you would call normal or a typical amount. So we use what's called the geometric mean here rather than an arithmetic mean. All that means is it's a lot closer to a median, and it adjusts for various distributions. So when we see this 195K overall demand, that is the geometric mean or the typical overall demand across those 1,500 cases. Now, as we look at each of these industries, what we're looking for is whether or not the typical value for that industry plus its margin of error crosses that overall line. If it crosses that, we can't say statistically in a significant way that industry's values are different from the overall. But what you will notice, hopefully, is that there are 3 industries here that stand out. Critical infrastructure, which I don't think was on anyone's bingo card for seeing the lowest typical demand amounts. Healthcare, also below overall, and then manufacturing slightly above. The rest of them, they're basically the same as the overall. So they weren't apparently targeted with higher demands by these actors in this time frame. We found this to be an unintuitive but an important finding, and hopefully that kind of combats some of the anecdotal evidence you've come across. That also lands in the category of, well, I can't help that. I'm either in healthcare or I'm not. Like we can't just shift industry just to reduce our demand amounts. Thanks a lot, John. Another thing you can't control is the family you get targeted by. But we do see differences in demands and payment amounts by family. So here, again, we're looking at a log scale. On the x-axis, these are demands. On the y-axis, there are payments. I've zoomed in on just one family to orient us to this chart. Reval was the most prominent family in the data set for this time period, so they're pretty representative. But what you'll see is this bright white point is the typical demand, the intersection of the typical demand and the typical payment for this family. This solid region is where the 50% most likely values landed. So if you got hit by Reval in this time frame, there's a 50% chance that your demand and your payment landed in this region. And then where it kind of fades out is out to the 90% likely. There's only a 10% chance that your values would have been outside of this region. And then these dashed lines behind it represent the overall again. We talk about the overall typical demand and the overall typical payment. Now that's super interesting to me, at least, just looking at an individual family. But what's more fascinating, I think, is to talk about it in the context of other families that were observed. So here's our not so good friend Reval in the bottom left here. But these are organized in descending order from left to right and top to bottom. So during this time period, if you were hit by Maze, you were certainly going to be see a bigger demand and a bigger payment. And you would have probably much preferred to be hit by Phobos, who routinely saw lower demands and lower payments. The color coding is kind of bespoke to the reports. At the time we published, this was an estimated activity level of families. Dark blue indicating they were either defunct or less active, light blue being reduced activity or stable, and then the fuchsia was increasing activity at the time. So yeah, to me, one of the funny things that jumps out here is, for example, NetWalker here in this top center. You might notice there's kind of two distinct regions that you might have landed in for the 50%. And that's because in about April of 2020, NetWalker shifted very distinctly from a high volume, low demand business model to higher demands. So that's kind of where you see this jump from the bottom left to the top right quadrant. They apparently did some business case analysis and determined that they need to up their prices. So good for them, I suppose. All right, so that's demand amounts. Okay, what about payment likelihood? So the demand came in, what determines or what can influence whether or not a demand even gets paid? Well, one thing is the initial demand. So the previous speakers were kind of talking about various tactics that are at play during negotiations. And the truth is, if you've ever bought a used car, you would recognize a lot of them. In this case, we actually see where there's, it kind of backfires when they use some sticker shock tactics. In the bright blue, you see the distribution of demand amounts when the demand ultimately got paid. And then you see in the dark blue behind it, the distribution of demand amounts when the ransom went unpaid. And what you can see is the lower demands were more likely to be paid than the higher demands. And that's somewhat intuitive, but it's also nice to have to bring data to an anecdote fight, right? We can say for a fact, yep, if you are pricing out your customers, you will not see payments as often. Another thing that can influence payment likelihood, we do see that some industries appear to be more willing to pay than others. It's worth noting in this case, there's probably some overlap between lower demands into higher payment likelihood as well as industry effects. So just so that disclaimer's out there. But if you follow healthcare here, you can see they're kind of middle of the pack as far as our data set for prevalence. They have lower than typical demands, lower than typical payments, and then they have seemingly above typical likelihood of paying. So this is just another thing that, again, you can't control it, but it's helpful to know that some industries have a higher propensity toward paying to get back online or recover their data, what have you. Now, this is something you can influence as a defender yourself somewhat, but within the data set, the responders in many cases were able to identify whether or not privileges were escalated, or an attack, whether the attacker achieved privilege escalation or used a privilege escalation technique. What you see on the far right, where it says overall, is the overall payment likelihood for the sample, and then where attackers were able to escalate privileges, that overlaps with the overall. So where they could escalate privileges, the difference between whether or not you did or didn't pay was not measurable. But in cases where the attacker was unable to escalate privileges, those organizations did in fact have a lower likelihood of payment. So less likely to pay if you can deny privilege escalation, which again, that makes sense. If they can't escalate privileges, they're probably going to be less successful in achieving their other objectives further down the chain. Now, one thing that is often brought up in the discussion about whether or not a ransom gets paid is backups, right? Well, I've got kind of some good news, bad news here, but we'll start with the bad news. So in a past life, I was assessing disaster recovery exercises, and in the weeks and months leading up to those assessments, I would hear in conference room after conference room in planning discussions that we have backups, there's nothing to worry about, we have them, we do backups, don't sweat it, we've got backups. Well, these responders were able to identify those organizations that, quote, had backups or performed them regularly, and then we assessed whether or not they demonstrated a different likelihood of paying. And unsurprisingly, to someone who has done those assessments of DR exercises in the past, the answer is no, there was no difference between those organizations that, quote, performed backups and those that did not. However, those that could demonstrate an ability to actually recover did have a lower likelihood of paying. So in at least for several years until more recently, the primary method of cashing out was the denial of access and then restoring access. So if you're able to recover access without the attacker's assistance, then good for you. You removed all their leverage. Now that we see more double extortion coming into play, that really only addresses half of the issue, but it's an important half. So please, please, please test those backups, test the ability to recover. For the love of everything, please test that. Okay, next big question, what influences payment amounts? So we've covered demand amounts, we've covered likelihood of payment, and now we're talking about payment amounts. All right, this was kind of being brought up at the tail end of the last discussion, so I love being able to follow up with this. So let's look at this slowly. At the very bottom, those organizations that saw initial demands of under $10,000 were likely to pay at or above that $10,000 or the amount of the demand initially. But we see a downward pressure on the percent of demand paid as the demand goes up. So as we climb up and up and up, let's look at this 100K to 250K initial demand amount. You are likely to pay about 60% of that demand. So if it's 200K, 60% of 200K. And then as you get up to these really, really big ones, over 2 mil, you're more likely to pay about a quarter of that. Now, I'm not a betting man, but I think most of us would prefer to pay 100% of a $10,000 demand than a quarter of a 2 million demand. That's just math, but it's helpful to know that you don't want to use just one percentage for your discount, regardless of the demand you see as a negotiator, because there's kind of this, oops, oh, I've just destroyed all the slides. You've seen all the secrets that come at the end. Oh no, that's what happens when I get excited and scroll. But just, here we go. We'll get there, perfect. But yeah, so it's important to know that as the ransom goes up, so does the discount, and you need to know that. Don't pay sticker price. You might be wondering, well, gosh, why would I pay more than the ransom demand if you're looking at that below 10K amount? That was an interesting little fad that was kind of going on, I want to say about 2 years ago, where attackers would say, oh yeah, here's the price for recovery. And you'd pay the price and you'd be like, wow, that was surprisingly inexpensive. And then they'd say, oh, no, that was for one key. You want more keys, right? Yeah, that's per key. So then, yeah, that was re-extortion. Yeah, that's a fun one. All right, more on influencing payment amounts. Our old friend, victim recovery. So again, those victims that were able to recover not only had a lower likelihood of payment, but when they paid, they also paid less than the others. Okay, that makes sense. Let's just keep it to single extortion, if you please, rather than double. Even if I can recover, I may still have some interest in paying to not release the stolen data, et cetera, but interesting to see that you kind of get to double dip if you have effective recovery practices. All right, what influences payment amounts? The third point, I think. The keen-eyed among you will notice that this chart is talking about demands, but hopefully you're tracking that demand amounts influence payment amounts. So things that affect demand amounts thereby can influence payment amounts. So in the bright blue, what you're looking at is demands when there was no data exfiltration. So single extortion, only for access. And then in the dark blue behind it is that distribution of demands when there was exfiltration involved, so double extortion. So hopefully you can see the difference. This light blue mass is to the left of the dark blue one. You might be wondering, well, what's the difference actually? Well, it's about 5 times. The demands themselves go out by about 5 times in the typical and also the 95th percentile case, or what we call extreme. When the attacker knows that they also stole your data, they know they have more leverage, thereby increasing the price tag. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussion about like current trends in ransomware, and how things aren't the same because they do change. So we had similar questions that we wanted to see if we could get answers in the data set. What is changing over time, at least within the scope of the data under review here? So first, hopefully that says demands, but not payments. So let's look at these dark blue spots first. These are a measure of typical demands for a 90-day window at each given point across this time frame. And you can see, gosh, yeah, man, the demands really do start creeping up. And then there's this weird fall off, and then they seem like they're creeping up again. If you happen to follow the Bitcoin market, however, that would seem suspiciously similar to the Bitcoin valuations for the exact same time period. And that's because most of these demands were understandably denominated in Bitcoin. What's fascinating, though, is you see a much flatter kind of trend for these bright blue spots along the bottom, and that indicates the typical payments for the same timeframes. So there's definitely some logic behind, throw out a price maybe a little sloppily because you're just denominating. You said it cost, X Bitcoin for me to as an initial ransom here, and you just didn't particularly care that the underlying currency was fluctuating at the time. But when it comes down to brass tacks, you know how much dollars you want to cash out. We've also annotated, there's a question about the effect of the White House executive order that I think was in summer of 2021. Maybe it had some effect, hard to say, but at least give some context. What else is changing over time? Same song and dance here, the families that you're dealing with. I won't go into depth on any particular families here, just noting that of the top 10 most active families observed in this data in 2019, only one appeared in 2022. And then a whole host of new names appeared following 21 and 22. So this to me is kind of a cautionary tale about when you're thinking about adversary emulation, about getting too tunnel visioned on a particular, threat group. We'll kind of talk about this a little later, but we want to start thinking about aggregations of techniques rather than individual actors when we're planning out our defensive strategy, right? What else is changing? Well, I've mentioned the rise of double extortion, not the first two, but you can see starting in 2019, about 9 out of 10 cases were just single extortion. It was all about getting access, restoring access to data. We go to 2020, 21, 22, we're up to more than half of cases involve double extortion or data theft on top of encryption. All right, so it's all, how can data science help us with defense and negotiation? Here you go. If you've been listening this long, this is for you. So one approach that you can take is what we did, which is we took the most prominent families and we pulled out all their TTPs via the attack framework, and we mapped those to their relevant mitigations. And what you see here is within the initial access tactic, what mitigations would have affected a percent of cases in that tactic. So in this case, user training would have been applicable to about 54% of cases that had some initial access technique identified. Now, you say what you like about attack framework and the mitigations mappings. They are necessarily generic, but I think it's a great place to start, and it's better than nothing. And as kind of a way to structure your approach to handling a given threat, in this case ransomware, I think it's you could do a lot worse. So following this kind of model, this is how you might deal with the initial access component. Now, I'll confess, we did not go tactic by tactic. We kind of broke it up into 3 major phases. We had initial access, stuff in the middle that we just bucketed as post-compromise, and then impact and exfiltration on the other end. So we took all those TTPs between the bookends, and we mapped those as well to mitigations. And since we're only talking about ransomware, it shouldn't be a surprise that data backups play a very prominent role in mitigating the 100% of these cases where we identified techniques there. This is less, I'm hopefully being clear. I'm not expecting you to like be parsing this bar by bar and like 94.1% of da-da-da. I'm just demonstrating the idea that this is an approach that can be taken if you want to take a tactic by tactic approach to developing your organization's mitigation strategy. Lastly, the impact and exfiltration tactics. You can see we have like a little lower impact or a little lower influence here, but data loss prevention in more than a third of cases would have been applicable. Again, that's largely informed by the rise of double extortion. Now that's one approach. Another approach you could say, gosh, we don't really want to break up all of our scenarios into tactic by tactic breakdowns and stack our defenses. What if we just wanted to go for a bang for buck approach? So we took all the techniques from all the prominent families, and then we weighted them appropriately. So the techniques used by Revel in our data set have appropriate multipliers applied to them, same down the line. And then you could link those to their mitigations. And what's interesting here is since mitigations end up having, I appreciate the ping there. Since the mitigations can map to multiple techniques, you can actually kind of double or triple or quadruple or quintuple dip on those mitigations. And when in my GRC days, this was something we would come across a lot, where we would be asked for kind of the collateral impact of defenses, because very often we'd be asked, how will we solve risk scenario Z? And then we would have kind of some risk treatment options. And then the next question we'd get asked is like, okay, well, we want to kind of enhance the business case for this. Can you tell us what else these might help us solve? What else these defenses might help us solve, so that we can kind of demonstrate more value than just this one scenario. And I think this is an interesting and a powerful way to think about that. Most notably with this approach, you can see that behavior prevention on endpoint has risen to the top of the stack because it applies to so many different techniques that appear across the various families using these different techniques. I will also note that anyone in the know also sees that command and scripting interpreter T1059 is basically like saying attacker used a computer. So there's nothing very enlightening there, but the downstream mappings to mitigations, we do find interesting. All right, so that's the defense. Now let's also talk negotiation. The first and foremost thing, and I'm not the first to bring this up, but you want to set negotiations in your organization first. You don't want to be under the very common time pressure tactics that attackers use and not know the answer to very important questions like, will we pay or can we pay, even if we choose to pay? There are several threat actors who, due to government sanctions, you're not allowed to pay. You may or may not know that where there's a will, there's a way, whatever, but you're not supposed to pay those actors because of government sanctions. In other cases, there are executives or decision makers in organizations who simply will not pay on principle for whatever reason. So wouldn't it stink to put in a lot of time and energy and stress and anxiety figuring out how to pay, and when you find out, well, we're not going to pay anyway, even if we got it down to 1% of the demand, we're just not going to pay. So having that understanding out the gate, super useful. Something else that is worth doing is kind of understanding the market for demands and payments and tracking it a little if you can. What you see here on the right is all of those demands and payments. And what should stand out to you first and foremost is that 70% of payments were less than the demand. So just as the previous speakers mentioned, the threat actors show up expecting to negotiate in the majority of cases. Very few cases just end up paying sticker price, and even fewer end up paying above sticker price. And what you can see in the fuchsia there is those cases are generally to the left. So those lower demand amounts where they kind of reel you in, we call that a foot in the door tactic, or if you've ever paid for replaceable razor cartridges. They'll give you the handle, but they'll sell you the razor blades for, a big markup. That's that business model at work. Similarly, you should be very, very, very skeptical of any source that talks about averages in this space. We mentioned that the distribution of these values is log normal, and that means something when we start talking about what is normal or what is typical. Averages in this space, just for comparison's sake, the average demands in this data set were over $1 million. But when you use a more appropriate measurement of typical, such as a median or a geometric mean, which is what we use, you see that what you should expect is very different if you're talking about average or typical. The same goes for payments. Less than 100K is typical for the payments in this data set, whereas the average would tell you that it's over $250,000, over $350,000. And what we know from economics in general is that when you're talking about prices, expectations have a direct impact on pricing, just like inflation. If everyone thinks inflation is going up and everyone knows that everyone else thinks inflation is going up, inflation is gonna go up. Same thing happens in demands and payments. So having an appropriate measurement to use when we're talking about these things is very important. And if you see someone talking about averages, you should dig deeper and try to understand why they're talking about averages. Do they just want to show big numbers, or do they maybe not understand that data, for that kind of data, that's not really telling you what you think it's telling you, or do they have some other purpose? And I mean, if I haven't said it enough here, test the backup and recovery plans. Please, please, please test them, make sure they work. If you are counting on backups being your saving grace, make sure they actually work through a variety of methods. But if I had a Dogecoin for every time someone who had backups still had to pay to recover, I'd be a Doge millionaire, I suppose. Now, it looks like I'm good on time. So we've got a couple of bonus round questions or little nuggets for you here. The research, we had a variety of other questions come up. One was about re-extortion, those cases where, they say it's this price, you pay them that price, they come back with asking for more money. That's what we call re-extortion. That occurred in about 1 in 20 cases. And that practice kind of spiked about 2 years ago. So it's not necessarily as common now as it was then. So it's just helpful to know, not super common. 19 out of 20 times, you're just dealing with what you see. Double extortion, however, we're up to over half of the cases where we see both encryption and data theft. I mean, data theft is a classic for a reason. So it's on the rise. I'm sure you're aware of this, but numerically speaking, about half of times you're also dealing with data theft on top of losing access. And then the question that I think always comes up, mostly in the boardroom, but how likely is this miscreant to take our money and run? Well, whatever you think, good or bad news, it's pretty unlikely. In this data set, less than 1 in 100 cases involved payment received and without restoring access. So should that be the path your organization chooses, you can be reasonably confident that they're not going to take your money and run. And a big part of that comes down to even criminals have a reputation to maintain. And if word gets out that this particular actor doesn't deliver the goods when paid, they reduce their likelihood of getting paid the next time, right? So pretty basic business sense there. And with that, thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain questions or talk about any variety of references made. So.